Okay, this is our second and last set of notes for this unit. We are talking about groups of arthropods. So in the previous set of notes, we just looked at general structures, like general characteristics of arthropods, but we didn't really have enough time to break down the individual subgroups within arthropods and the distinctions between them. So that's what this set of notes is focused on. You should have received a handout. Make sure that you have that handout and use it for these notes. If there are diagrams, well, not if, there will be diagrams, and make sure that those diagrams you add the labels that are missing. Especially with the crayfish, because that is your next dissection. And then also, as usual, make sure you have either audio going with your headphones plugged in, or have captions going so that you can catch anything that I say that isn't necessarily on the slide. Okay, let's get started. So, like I said before, in the previous set of notes, we looked at the general characteristics of arthropods, but arthropods are such a wide group that there are subgroups within arthropods. Specifically, there are 3 of them. And the way that we classify arthropods in one of the 3 groups is either based on the number or structure of their body segments. So remember, their body segments are just major divisions of their body. Or we might even classify them according to their appendages. Remember that appendages are extensions or structures that are attached to those main body segments. Most especially, we use their mouth parts as a way of distinguishing one type of arthropod versus the other. And we'll find with the 3 types of arthropods, their mouth parts are quite different from one another. Speaking of, let's list out those 3 major groups of arthropods. So there are crustaceans, spiders and their relatives, and insects and their relatives. And we're going to look at each of these 3 main groups throughout the course of this set of notes. Let's start with crustaceans. So crustaceans are primarily aquatic. We can find them in both oceanic and freshwater, so saltwater and freshwater. Crustaceans exist. And a number of these include crabs, shrimps, lobsters, crayfish, or crayfishes, and barnacles. Okay, in terms of main body plan for crustaceans, they typically have 2 pairs of antennae, 2 or 3 body sections, and their mouth parts are chewing mouth parts called mandibles. If you were to look at the body segments or the body sections of a crustacean, we're going to use the crayfish as an example. There's generally 2. There are generally 2 of them, especially with when we're thinking of lobsters, crayfish, and shrimp. You have an anterior body section called a cephalothorax. And cephalothorax, just think of it as almost like like if you think of the grasshopper dissection that we did last week. Usually remember that the first section is called the head, the second section is the thorax. A cephalothorax is basically those 2 kind of fused together. And they're fused together and covered by a carapace, which is just like a part of the exoskeleton that covers the cephalothorax. It tends to be the most distinctive and toughest part of the exoskeleton. So there's an anterior body section, and then there's a posterior body section, which we call the abdomen. Then with crustaceans, in terms of their appendages, particularly on the cephalothorax, the first 2 pairs of appendages are antennae, and these have a number of different functions. In crayfish, in lots of crustaceans, the antennae are primarily sense organs, so they are used, they kind of wave around and sense the environment around them. Sometimes they have little sensory hairs on them. In other crustaceans, they help with filter feeding, or in some cases, they even help with swimming. So they have a variety of functions depending on what type of crustacean you're looking at. But the first two pairs of appendages are antennae, and then the third pair of appendages are mandibles, and these are their mouth parts that are specifically adapted for biting and grinding their food up. Sometimes gills are also attached to the appendages associated with the cephalothorax as well. You might find gills, depending on, again, the crustacean we're looking at. Okay, so you should have this diagram. Let's add these labels in. And so let's start with the body segments. So this part right here, from that first section to the tip of the head, that whole thing would be considered the cephalothorax. And that you'll see is where all of the legs and so on are attached. And then the second half, so this tough outer skeleton that covers the cephalothorax on the dorsal side, or just kind of covering all the soft tissues inside, that's called the carapace. And then you have the second half, which is the abdomen right here. Okay, these appendages coming off of the anterior part of the carapace of the cephalothorax, these are the antennae. So you have the first antennae, which are smaller, at least with the crayfish, they're smaller. There's the second antennae, the longer ones that they're segmented. You can see segmentation a little bit with all of them. And then you have the mandibles, which are these structures right here that are used for grinding and biting food. Okay, decapods are basically another name for crayfish, lobsters, and crabs. Decapods are considered the largest group of crustaceans, and a main characteristic of them is that they have 5 pairs of legs. Okay, the first pair of legs, at least in crayfishes, are called chelipeds, and these chelipeds are they have claws on them, and these claws are used to catch, pick up, crush, and cut up their food. So they help with, they're considered the claws, but technically they're called chelipeds. And then after this first pair of legs, you have walking legs, which I don't have listed on here, but we'll point them out on the diagram. The other legs are called walking legs. On the abdomen, there are also little appendages that are flipper-like. These are called swimmerets, and they're named that because they help with swimming. So they wave or flap around, and that helps propel the decapod forward. Okay, the final abdomen segment is what's actually officially called the tail. So you can see you'll see a few paddle-like appendages kind of fuse together, and they form a tail at the very, very posterior end of the abdomen. All right, let's point these things out on the diagram. Oops. So this first leg would be the chelipeds. So this first pair of legs would be the chelipeds. That is a claw also. It's just a little bit modified. It's a little bit different in its appearance. This is also kind of at a different angle, but they are a matching set. They look just like this. Both of them do. And then the other 4 pairs, because that's the first pair. Remember, decapods have 5, so the other 4 are the walking legs. And so those are just, as the name implies, they're used for walking. Okay, on the abdomen here you can see the little paddle-like structures on the ventral side. These are the swimmerets. Excuse me. So they would be waving and helping with swimming through the water. And right at the very, very end, very posterior end of the abdomen, you have the tail, where you have a bunch of paddle-like appendages that are all fused together and form the tail. So in a lobster, for example, if ever you've ordered like lobster tail at a restaurant, this whole thing is called the tail to us, but technically it's just this part here that's officially the tail. This is all just part of the abdomen instead. Okay, so that's it for crustaceans. We didn't really talk so much about barnacles, but barnacles are another group of crustaceans. They don't have a similar body plan. They're sessile. They stay in one place, and they have a modified body for the way that they exist, the fact that they're stationary, they don't swim around. So if you do want more information on barnacles, they're found on page 721 of the textbook. All right, in the meantime, let's move on to spiders and their relatives. So spiders and their relatives are part of a subphylum called chelicerates. And chelicerates include horseshoe crabs, spiders, which are these guys right here, ticks, and that's an example of a tick. This is an example of a mite, which falls kind of in the same group as ticks, and then scorpions. All of these are called chelicerates. And a main characteristic of chelicerates is they do not have any antennae. So they have a different means of sensing the world around them. They'll use other methods. And they also have, as you know, one of the main things is their mouth parts are very distinctive. In fact, they're called chelicerae. They actually have two pairs of appendages attached to their mouth, and these are called the chelicerae. They also have only two body sections. So they have a cephalothorax, just like crustaceans. They have a cephalothorax part, and then they have an abdomen part. Okay, in terms of the number of walking legs that they have, while crustaceans have 5, spiders and their relatives have 4 pairs of walking legs. Okay, you have this diagram. We're going to add a bunch of labels to this over the course of the next few slides. So this is a spider, and the chelicerae, I'm going to point them out right here. Chelicera is plural, chelicera, or you could say chelicera or chelicerae. I think chelicera is actually, sorry, that's singular, that's plural. Okay, so the chelicerae they're the pair of appendages attached or near the mouth that are unique in that they have fangs on them. You can see a little pointy structure here, distinctive pointy needle-like structure, and that is used to stab and paralyze their prey. So they actually have a venom gland attached to that, attached to these chelicerae. And when they bite their prey, they'll inject a little bit of the venom, and that paralyzes their prey so that they can eat them. They also have a second pair of appendages near their mouth called pedipalps, and pedipalps are a little bit longer than chelicerae, and they're used to grab their prey, grab and hold their prey. Okay, now chelicerates have 2 main classes. There are Merostomata, and Merostomata is the smaller group of the 2. Merostomata just basically include horseshoe crabs. So horseshoe crab is a bit of a misnomer because they're not a crustacean. They don't have they are aquatic and they do have a very hard exoskeleton. But as you can see with the body plan, they don't really, they look quite different from a typical crustacean. And so they actually are more, in terms of their anatomy, they're more like spiders and their relatives. Okay, now Merostomata, horseshoe crabs, are some of the oldest organisms, or oldest living arthropods. They haven't really changed in a very long time. They first appeared more than 500 million years ago, and the fossil record has Meristomata ancestors looking very similar to what we see today. So they haven't really changed very much in their body plan over time. They are heavily armor plated, and their anatomy is very close to spiders. They have chelicerae. They have a long tail used for movement, and they tend to live around the shore area. Okay, so that's Meristomata, which is kind of just horseshoe crabs. And then you have the other class, which are arachnids, arachnida. And these include spiders, such as this one here, mites, ticks, and scorpions. Okay, so with spiders, this is the largest group of arachnids. And they are, in terms of the way that they feed, they capture and feed on animals, ranging from other arthropods, like other small insects, to in some cases even small birds. So they can get quite huge. And they just catch their prey in a variety of ways. Some of them will spin webs to catch their prey. Some of them actually hunt. But all spiders do produce silk. So even tarantulas that are primarily get their food by hunting, they still produce silk as well, which they use, which they will use to help to create a habitat where they can like lay eggs and so on. Okay, spiders will spin this silk into webs, cocoons for eggs, there we go, or when they catch prey, they also use that silk to wrap up their prey and immobilize them so that they can ingest them, so they can eat them. Okay, now the way that spiders produce silk is they force liquid silk, liquid substance, through these organs called spinnerets, and these spinnerets have silk glands that produce this liquid silk, and then that silk comes out in strands and eventually dries and becomes a little bit more like the typical spider silk that we're used to seeing. But it does start out as a liquid form and then eventually becomes the typical webbing. Okay, so let's point these out on the same diagram. Here you can see the silk glands. These are internal. This is this has been sectioned so that we can see inside of the spider. But there you have silk glands near the end of the abdomen, and then right at the tip of the abdomen, you have these structures here, and these are the spinnerets. And you'll notice there are several silk glands. It's not just one. There's several of them that are feeding these spinnerets to produce that silk. Okay, mites and ticks are smaller arachnids, quite small compared to the other types of arachnids. And for the most part, they're parasitic. So they get their food by attaching onto a host and primarily blood, drinking blood in order to get their nourishment. Okay, so their chelicerae and their pedipalps are specialized for digging into a host tissue and then sucking out blood. Some mites are parasitic towards plants. A good example would be like spider mites. I'm not sure if you've ever had a house plant that's been infested with spider mites, but they're parasites for plants. And so they would bite them and drink out fluid from the plant tissues. They can be a big problem for agricultural situations on crops, especially cotton. If you've ever seen a dog or an animal that has mange or scabies, these are mites as well, and so these cause itching and painful rashes in a lot of mammals, not just dogs, and even in humans sometimes. Another problem or secondary problem that comes up when it comes to ticks, such as this here. This is actually the underside of the tick. It's lying on its dorsum, but you can see that most of its body is this is actually its abdomen. Its cephalothorax is just that part right there with the biting parts attached. But ticks can transmit. There's a secondary problem that can arise in that they can pass on bacteria that can cause some serious diseases. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Lyme's disease, these are all caused by bacteria that's transmitted through ticks, such as this one here. Okay, scorpions are the last group of relatives to spiders, and scorpions inhabit warm areas around the world. Arizona is one of those places. I'm sure you've seen a scorpion at some point, and if you've lived here for a while, I'm sure you've seen one. They have their pedipalps actually enlarged to form claws. So these are part of those mouth parts. These are the second mouth parts that are able to grab their prey. And then when it comes to their cephalothorax, that's really just the first, wherever you can see the legs are attached. That's the cephalothorax here. And then when it comes to the abdomen that's long and segmented, with scorpions has a venomous stinger at the end, so that's used to kill or paralyze their prey. So they don't sting with chelicerae at the front or bite and inject venom that way. They inject venom through the end of their tail, the end of their abdomen. Okay, they have, when it comes to their chelicerae are adapted to almost grind or chew their prey, and so they have this kind of rubbing motion similar to how mandibles are. Their chelicerae do the same sort of thing. They kind of rub together, and that's how they grind down their prey to eat them. Okay, insects and their relatives is the third and final group of arthropods. And centipedes, millipedes, and insects all belong to this subphylum, Uniramia. And they are, some of their main characteristics are that they have jaws, they have one pair of antennae, and then when it comes to their appendages, they are unbranched. So they don't really have like branching like you would see with claws or anything like that. Centipedes, which are this right here, and millipedes, like this one right here, they are long. Their body is quite long and has multiple segments, and their segments have legs attached to them. They kind of look more worm-like. These are their own kind of their own classes, I should say. Each of these are a class of insect. And then you have the more typical insects itself that we're going to look at for the remainder of these notes. Okay, so insects, unlike spiders that have two body segments, insects have three. They have a head, so from anterior to posterior, they have a head, then a thorax, then an abdomen. And you've already seen this, especially with the grasshopper dissection. But there they are. So head, thorax, and abdomen. And then insects typically have three pairs of legs, and all three of them are attached to the thorax area, which, again, you would have seen in the grasshopper dissection. All three of their pairs of legs were attached, for the most part, to the thorax region, not so much the abdomen or the head. Okay, so insects have a segmented body, an exoskeleton, and jointed appendages. Again, we've said that before. A typical insect will also have a pair of antennae, a pair of compound eyes, and in some cases they'll have other eyes as well, like when it comes to the grasshoppers that you dissected, there were ocelli as well. Ocelli are just like simplified eyes in addition to their compound eyes. They also have two pairs of wings on their thorax. Okay, now insects have three pairs of appendages that are used as mouth parts. One of those pairs of appendages are the mandibles, and then they will have the other appendages are going to be kind of specialized for the type of food that they're going to eat and how they get that food. So you have a diagram here of some examples of mouth parts. This is an ant, and in this case their mandibles are modified to saw and grind at their food. They cut through, a lot of ants will cut through larger prey if they break down other arthropods for their food. Sometimes some ants are they break down plant matter, and so their mouth parts are more like scissor-like to cut through plant matter. But in any case, yeah, they're adapted for the type of food that they eat. Down here, I believe this is a moth or a butterfly, but you can see that their mouth part is very different. They still have these these parts as well, but in order to suck nectar out of a flower, they have a long tube-like mouth part that they can uncurl and insert into a flower to get all the way down to where the nectar is. And then this is a fly, and you can see that their mouth part has this kind of sponge-like end to it, and that's actually used to kind of soak up or absorb food and bring it towards their mouth. Okay, insects have, I mentioned this already, 3 pairs of walking legs. These are used for walking, jumping, or capturing and holding their prey, and they're all attached to the thorax. They typically have 2 pairs of wings, which you saw in the grasshoppers. They're made out of chitin. Remember, chitin is that very tough carbohydrate that's used it's really sturdy and used almost structurally. Okay, remember, there are 4 wings and hind wings. 4 wings generally are, excuse me, are tougher and more protective, and the hind wings are the ones that are used for flight. Okay, and flight is a very important adaptation for insects because it allows them to travel long distances to colonize a wide variety of habitats. Okay, in terms of reproduction, one of the main characteristics of insects is their ability to go through something called metamorphosis. And metamorphosis is a process of changing shape or form as an insect goes from newly hatched out of an egg all the way until adulthood. Okay, and there are 2 types of metamorphosis. There's either incomplete metamorphosis or complete metamorphosis. So we're going to look at the difference between the 2 here. All right, let's start with incomplete metamorphosis. Now, incomplete metamorphosis is where the way you can tell is if you look at an insect when it's an adult compared to when it's freshly hatched out of an egg, they look very, very similar. So the young insect, which we call a nymph, these are immature forms. These look very close to the adult, not only in terms of appearance, but even in terms of behavior, the type of food that they eat, the way that they move around, very, very similar. And so the only distinct difference that we can see is a change in size, maybe a little bit change in coloration as well. But for the most part, they have the same body plan. And whenever we have an insect that matures in this way, we call it incomplete metamorphosis. Okay, and so what will basically happen is a series of molts. Remember, molting is where the outer exoskeleton gets shed as the nymph gets bigger and bigger. So this nymph will get bigger. It get a little bit too big for its exoskeleton. It'll molt that skin and be able to get a little bit bigger, and so on and so on. And then eventually we'll get to a last molt where that nymph will shed its exoskeleton and emerge as the adult form. And there you go. That adult form is ready for reproduction to produce more eggs and so on. Complete metamorphosis, however, if you were to compare the adults versus the immature forms, you would see that they are very, very different, not only in terms of appearance, but also the way that they behave, maybe possibly the type of food that they will eat, the way that they move around. A lot of insects that mature by complete metamorphosis, their adult forms have the ability to fly, whereas their immature forms do not. Okay, here we have a ladybird, for example. That's a good example. Butterflies fall under this category as well, as you can see over here. Okay, so what ends up happening is after an egg, after they hatch out of their egg, they have these nymph stages, or larva stages is another name for them, where it's kind of similar to the way an incomplete metamorphosis is. They kind of get bigger and bigger as they develop, and then eventually, after molting a few times, their last molt turns into something called a pupa. In butterflies, you might have heard it called a chrysalis before, but this is a dramatically different stage. During the pupal stage, the body is completely remodeled. Um, so this pupa stage kind of, it seems almost like it's a inactive period, but there's a lot happening inside of the exoskeleton, to transform the body completely. And when the adult emerges, we have a completely different animal. Okay. And so yeah, so that's the main difference between the two. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So in terms of insect communication, insects will communicate in a variety of ways using sounds. Let's, for example, crickets. If you think of the way crickets chirp, they're calling for a mate. Sometimes visual communication in their, if you think of fireflies and how they will use, they'll use like light flashes. It's like a bioluminescence from their tails, from their abdomens. Chemical, like pheromones, releasing certain pheromones that are chemicals that can kind of signal other insects that they are looking for a mate. There's a variety of signals that insects will use. And most of the time, this communication is to find a mate. So all these different, there's like a variety of different ways. We're not going to talk about all of them, but insects communicate a variety of ways, particularly just to find a mate. Lastly, on page 732, 733 of the textbook, we talk a little bit about insect societies. So there are some insects that are that form these complex associations and almost like colonies, and these are called societies. So some examples are ants, bees, termites. They form kind of like a complex, almost like a little city, or community where all the individuals within that community have various jobs and various roles for the greater good of the entire society. So a society is a group of closely related animals that work together for some common benefit. And within that society, a lot of times you'll have things called castes. I realize I don't have it on this slide, but castes are just different groups of individuals within that society. So, for example, if you were to look at, let's say, a hive of bees, which is a society, you would have some bees that are worker bees that have a certain role, some bees that are drones that have a certain role, and then you have the queen, she has her own role. And so these different groups within that society kind of work together for the benefit of the entire hive. Okay, and I believe that's it for these notes. Yes, that's it. Okay, thank you.